Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Arts Management webinar, which is already our 84th edition of the German Treffpunkt Kulturmanagement and only the second international one. And of course, we are very happy to have our guest today, Leah Hamilton. And Leah is an arts management lecturer and arts manager, and she is an expert in crisis communication and crisis management in the arts. So I'm sure that regarding the current situation of COVID-19 or Corona, she will have to say a lot of interesting things to us today. But before we start, I would like to say two more things. The first is, if you have any questions, you can just write them here in Zoom in the chat, or when you're joining us via Facebook live stream, you can write them in the comments there, and we will collect them and make sure that Leah can answer as much of them as possible during the next hour or so. And the second thing is, if you would like to have a participation certificate, you can just write us an email with all of your data and we will send you one for a small amount of about €5 to make sure that either your employer or your applications or whatever, you can show that you have taken part in this webinar. Our Treffpunkt Kulturmanagement is a joint initiative that we of Kulturmanagement Network and Arts Management Network do together with our partners Christian Henner-Fehr and David Rödler, who can both unfortunately not be here with us today, but we are of course sending warm greetings to them. And by now I would say we're gonna start. I'm giving the word to Leah and we're very happy to have you here today.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks to you and to the team at Kulturmanagement for having me as part of your Treffpunkt series, especially being the second international one. I feel a sense of pride and a bit of pressure too. So, but I'm honored to be here to talk about this subject today, which is, for many years I've been screaming from the rooftops about how important crisis and emergency management is in the cultural sector. And then the pandemic hit, and now all of a sudden I've been much busier than I have in many years. I also had a baby about 8 months ago, so I feel like I'm the busiest I've been maybe in my life right now. But I'm delighted to be here to talk with you all today about this important topic. And I know that Kristen discussed this, but just in case you're joining us just now, if you're having any trouble accessing the media or hearing, please just type your problem into the chat box and someone at the Kulturmanagement team will get back to you as soon as possible. Also, with questions, I do want this to be interactive due to the number of participants. What I've done is I've just created Q&A sections throughout, and you'll see that I have a slide that indicates the Q&A time. But of course, if you think of a question in the moment, please go ahead and put that into the chat box or the chat box immediately, and I will get to that at the appropriate section. And if I don't answer your question today, I will be putting my email up at the end, and I invite you to email me directly, and I will send a response personally to you. And I believe everyone is now muted for the webinar section, which is why we'll use the chat box for any questions or concerns. Okay, so just briefly, a little introduction. My name is Leah Hamilton, and I am a class doing research and using spreadsheets made me a little bit of an outlier in the performance sector. I moved into arts management, and I ran a large arts center in the state of Missouri in the United States for many years. And it was there that I learned many things as a practitioner. And one is that often cultural managers are not particularly prepared for crisis or emergency management. It's not addressed as a priority in cultural management education programs generally. And that is, when I say that, specific to English-speaking countries. But it was when I moved into academia that I really started to focus on emergency management. My dear friend and cultural manager in 2013 experienced in the United States an active shooting incident at her theater that killed 2 patrons. And it was during that time that I thought, this is what I want my research focus to be. And of course, with climate change, creating severe weather events, the mass migration of people, and the pandemic, obviously it's highlighting how important this topic is to our sector. So today we will try to keep it to an hour. I will try to be pünktlich. I live actually in Germany right now. I'm coming to you from Wiesbaden, but I teach through the University of Kentucky in the United States. So I try to straddle the Atlantic gracefully on a daily basis. But the webinar today will be an hour. We're going to first talk about this word safe and what it means to us right now during the pandemic. We will then talk about perceptions of risk and how we're seeing varied behaviors to the pandemic and how we can use the idea of social and cultural influences and perceptions of risk to better communicate to patrons and staff so that they feel safer working and attending our events at our institutions. And then lastly, we'll talk about some areas of safety communications through writing what I'm calling a COVID commitment statement. So we will also have some polls throughout just to wake everybody up a little bit as we go through. And I will have Kristen launch those polls as we get to those sections. So the pandemic has created remarkable unknowns for our sector globally. It has rendered strategic plans, financial plans, and programming fairly obsolete. And now reopening plans are vulnerable to new information about the virus, which comes in daily. And it's also vulnerable to this complex network of information sources that is available to individuals, from governmental resources to traditional media, to social media, to word of mouth. And this range also in pandemic rules and regulations from country to country and even region to region has affected the cultural sector's ability to make informed decisions and keep the public's trust. So just looking at the EU and considering the variances that we've seen, various summer festivals, some have canceled completely, while some have opened to the public with social distancing. And we've even seen that German theaters have a different seating capacity compared to neighboring countries in Austria and Switzerland. So this diversity in policy making is tying cultural managers' hands, and it confounds the public. Are we or are we not safe? Are we safe to work? Are artists safe to perform? And this kind of atmosphere can lead to levels of trust in our institutions to decrease if we're not careful in our communications. And just as a side note, this situation is professional for many of us, but also it's personal. My husband is an opera singer, and he was in a hotel on March 12th when getting ready to go to a show when he received the call that his performance was canceled due to the pandemic and all future performances would be indefinitely. And he will be now traveling for his first production, his first performance in 8 months in November. So one of the most, I think, intriguing aspects of the pandemic has been this talk of reopening, reviving, and returning that's contingent on one word, and that word is safe. Of course, this word is relative. What might feel safe to you will not feel safe to someone else. And modern disaster science has this intriguing foundation to it that says that the idea of knowledge of risk, or conversely, the lack of knowledge, is socially produced. That society and culture, they shape what we consider safe for our organizations, for ourselves, and how we prepare for risks or emergencies. Now, this is not to say that the virus and other natural phenomena like hurricanes or tornadoes or severe weather don't exist in objective physical reality. They do. But what it is to say is that social processes are essential to how we frame how these forces of nature uh, affect us in relation to our lives. So as someone born in the United States in a region called Tornado Alley, this meme helps support this idea that risk is socially produced. The comments by this man in the photo, he went on the news the next day. His wife actually posted this. This was in Canada. This photo, it went viral. The news picked it up, interviewed him, and he said that, okay, while the tornado looked threatening in the photo, it was actually much further away than it appeared, and he was, quote, keeping an eye on it. So for those of you that don't experience tornadoes on a routine basis, this man's assessment of risk feels rather foolish, if not crazy. But for someone like me who's grown up with frequent tornadoes, this behavior is actually fairly normal. And social constructionism can help us, it can help explain this phenomenon, the idea that social interactions form what we think and say, whether it's actually a truth, statistical truth or not. And sometimes we cannot prove what we say is true and others might not believe it. In other cases, we can prove what we say is true and still others will not believe it. And this is because of their worldviews, these systems of meaning that have formed from social engagement that advance various worldviews. And these worldviews are the root of how biases are formed and why they change over time. So to get an idea of who is on the call with us today and where you are coming from, Kristen, if you could launch poll number 1, as we are discussing how risk perception varies region to region. If you could just quickly let us know today where you are coming from today. Okay, great. Thank you. So majority from Europe, it's wonderful. And then one from North America. This could be colleagues or students. So someone got up early. Thank you very much. I hope you have your coffee with you. Cheers. This will help us get an idea as other results are shown of how those perceptions of risk are coming to play. Thank you very much, Kristen. So if we take a look first at the psychological aspects of risk perception and decision making, it's important to look at sort of what I consider as a social science disaster researcher, the foundational research here by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky. They put forth this idea back in the 70s that people, rather than engaging in extensive calculations, they use their gut to respond to uncertain situations. And those gut instincts are essentially cognitive shortcuts that help us from getting this mental overload. And in the social science field, we can call those, and psychological field as well, call those heuristics. And understanding these various shortcuts can really help us better understand how people are reacting and behaving so differently during the pandemic, and how we can better communicate to such diversity of thought on a micro scale with our institutions and our stakeholder networks. So here are a few heuristics that are pertinent to our discussion today. And the latter have been built upon and have been discovered since Kahneman and Tversky's original work. So there's the availability heuristic, which is how quickly information can be drawn from memory. Information that is more traumatic or recent or vivid is what comes to us first. And an example is with my clients and students in the United States, active shooter events have typically been, over the past few years, the #1 thing on their minds that they would like to prepare for. Well, then the pandemic hit, and now it's the pandemic is what they would like to prepare for. And that is an example of availability. There's also myopia, this idea of short-sightedness, that there's an inability to take the longer view when you're thinking about risk. The affect heuristic, I think, is most present in artistic environments, and this is the reliance on emotion and not logic in decision-making. There's the status quo bias, that is the tendency to want things to remain the same rather than to have to make choices that involve change. And the optimistic bias, which is the tendency to think that risks in areas such as safety and health are lower than what others may face. So let's put this into context to audiences and staff for our cultural institutions in the pandemic. Statistically, audiences have been saying in surveys that they are less likely to attend, and they were less likely to attend earlier on in the pandemic. And that shows that availability heuristic. But now some are saying that they're more likely to attend, especially if the pandemic hasn't affected them directly. That could be economically, or that they haven't had someone in their network that has contracted the virus. And that's an example of myopia. From a cultural leader perspective, we're seeing some leaders wait it out, that they are canceling all programming until it is safe to reopen. The Metropolitan Opera is an example of that. And then we are also seeing, and that is an example of the status quo bias. And we are also seeing from cultural leaders that there's this optimistic or possibly an effect bias, that they are thinking that their risk is lower than what the government or other research firms might be saying. And we know this because they are showing outward frustration or retaliating against certain regulations. And I know there's been some controversy just here in Wiesbaden with the Hessische Staatstheater in that regard. So we're going to move on past the psychological discussion. But before we do that, I just want to stop for a moment to see if there are any questions thus far.
By now, we haven't had some.
Okay, great. Well, then I'll just keep going so we can make sure we stay with time. So obviously today we can't use complex psychometrics evaluations to gauge how we are all doing or what biases we've been using to cope with the pandemic. But there is one simple question that I'm going to ask of you today, and you can ask of other stakeholders, to sort of gauge the level of stress that individuals are feeling during this particular moment in time. If you could launch poll question number 2, Kristen. And this helps again gauge the emotional state of participants. So, poll number 2, how would you describe your own feelings currently during the pandemic? Okay. All right, if you could show the results. Kristen, thank you. So mostly calm, but next close is also anxious. So, and I would say that doing this similar webinar in the United States, it's interesting with the election approaching, and of course the number of cases in the United States, the majority have been saying anxious or very anxious. So it's interesting to get this feedback today, Matt. Thank you very much. So understanding how our stakeholders are feeling, and integrating this idea of heuristics into our work. And why would we do that during this pandemic? Well, in order, I believe, to successfully manage during this time and make meaningful safety plans that are custom to the people we serve and communicate with, we have to recognize the importance of the effect bias and understand what is influencing staff and patrons' minds and hearts, which means their feelings. And let me highlight one important distinction here with safety communications, that we really need to understand first the actual information needs of our stakeholders and not what we think they need, that we need to remove some assumptions, and I'll dig into that a little further. And part of how we can do that is exploring sort of our external environments in relation to the cultural institution and where it resides. And these four that I will highlight today do affect perceptions of risk and behavior. The economy, demographics, political and legal environment, and of course, technology, which is what we were talking about earlier before the webinar started. So when we're looking at the economy, what sort of influence does the economy have on perceptions of risk? If we look at the local market and interest rates, income and wage rates, the cost of living, as well as right now the rate of unemployment, this all influences how the pandemic has affected people in their lives. And with this particular crisis, we can look at what sectors are driving the economy most in the community, but also what sectors are most affected by the crisis. And poll question number 3 is a good question that can help a cultural leader gauge the influence of the economy and perception of risk locally with their stakeholders. Thank you, Kristen. So if you could answer this question about what value below do you think has been most prominent in your community during the pandemic so far? There's this survival value, the focus on economy and self, and then the self-expression value, which is thinking more broadly on a social equity platform, focus on public health, as well as protecting the environment. Okay. There we go. Thank you, Kristen. So interestingly, the survival value, that the economic concerns and protecting one's self and family is more prominent of a value. And I will say this is also what I am seeing in the United States with this particular survey question as well. But I will say that there is typically 0 or only 1 saying self-expression value is higher than survival value in the United States. So thank you very much. And if we also are looking at demography, or the demographics, socio-demographics of your region, and how this is important, there were some studies conducted in the United States in the late 90s and early aughts that showed just how race and gender influence how risk is perceived. And women and members of minority groups perceive risk vastly differently than Caucasian males. And this is when social scientists started to really pick up on the idea of how you have to message differently to different age groups, gender groups, but also we have to think about religious preferences and language too, and how we communicate and how that influences perception of risk. And of course, age plays a large role with this pandemic. Older individuals, 65 and older, are at higher risk, statistically speaking, with COVID-19, which for many cultural institutions, this is a majority of their patronage. And we need to continuously survey our political and legal environments, not only to understand state, regional, and federal guidelines, mandates, and regulations, but the political climate of an area can certainly put an organization at risk. An example, of course, is mask wearing has become increasingly political, especially, I know in Germany there have been protests, but also in the United States where trust in the government is certainly in decline. And poll question number 4 can help us gauge how individuals in our community are valuing governmental policies and their level of trust in government and each other. And that example I'll put up here. Thank you, Kristen. How well do you think, obviously this is subjective, this is based on your experiences and where you are living, but how well do you think members of your community are following the mandates and restrictions put forth? Okay. Thank you, Kristen. So 73% somewhat following mandates, and then 27 strictly following the mandates, which is again a bit different than what I'm seeing in the United States. I know we have one coming in from North America, but this is what I've been seeing in Germany as well. And I think generally you could say trust in government seems to be higher here in Germany right now compared to the United States. Thank you. And lastly, the technological environs of a community can certainly change and affect perception of risk in that it helps, it helps us understand, if we look at technological environments, how patrons and staff, their ability to access work online. Of course, we were talking earlier about the positive and negatives of streaming of shows and exhibitions. And then a cultural institution, of course, has to think about their level of liability when it comes to breaches and fraud. This particular environment also focuses on preferred communication channels with employees and patrons. And Kristen, if you could launch poll number 5, this can help cultural leaders understand where staff and patrons are getting their information that is influencing their behavior. And this can give us a bit of insight into technological access and as well. Thank you, Kristen. Okay, so what local sources of information do you think have been most reliable during this crisis so far? And this one is not selecting one only, it's checking all that apply. Okay. Okay, if you want to go ahead and share the results.
Don't you see them? You should see them.
Oh, you got them up there. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I didn't realize you had already done it. So 100% governmental sites. And this, of course, is a reflection, again, of trust, level of trust in government. And then it's helpful to see the newspaper and TV are also more than a majority in terms of important local sources of or information providers, communication channels. Interesting to see that social media is only 10% as well. Okay, thank you, Kristen. Okay, and before we move on, we'll just stop quickly to see if there have been any questions on the Facebook Live platform or on Zoom.
By now, we still don't have any questions.
Good, I will take that to be a sign that I have been clear, which is good. All right, wonderful. Let's move on then to the next. Well, I'll just recap really quickly about surveying local and regional environments, that taking time to understand, again, how these environments affect safety and the perceptions of safety will help ensure that whatever action plan and guiding principles you're using as a cultural institution are actually effective. And again, this means understanding the actual information needs of stakeholders and not what we think they need. And there are various methods that we can use to better understand the impact of these regional external environments. on our stakeholders. That could be direct survey questions, digital town halls on Zoom or other platforms, of course, governmental websites, if you are finding that those websites are still trusted channels for information, and of course, research firms and findings from those firms. Surveys can be immensely helpful right now. I've just been looking at a recent international survey through the Audience Outlook Monitor that included 500 arts organizations in the United States, Canada, and Australia. And it found that a majority of audiences are waiting for a vaccine or until the rate of infection is near zero before resuming their cultural experiences. And this kind of information is painful to hear, but it's clear that normal activity in our sector won't resume for some time. But it's also clear that we have to break our pattern of normal communication activity. And that gets to the heart of what I really would like to work on today with you. And that is thinking about how we are communicating our safety plans. Crisis communications is predominantly used with acute crises and acute events. But as we are feeling right now, and we know the pandemic is now become more chronic of an emergency, it is likely that fears during the pandemic will continue for years, even beyond having a broader portion of communities maybe immune or vaccinated against the virus. So we need to shift to thinking about safety communications in the long term. And this means that we need to think of all communications as a conversation, an exchange of information. It isn't just the risk communicator giving the information to the potential victim, but it is having that conversation and asking the potential victim to also provide feedback and have the opportunity to provide feedback. And I will get into some ways of doing that in just a moment. And this also includes having that exchange with all levels of staff and patrons. Since the pandemic began, stories have come across my desk from working professionals about senior leadership in cultural institutions, putting operating level administrators, staff, and artists on this quote, need to know basis. We'll let you know when you need to know. And this leaves them vulnerable with a lack of information and direction. Additionally, I have heard from numerous guest artists and musicians, those that are even further down on the hierarchy of an organization, that they have received little to no information regarding safety regulations and procedures before they are arriving to work. And this type of communication in a crisis is unfortunately common. Information that is relayed top down in this manner can help make an organization seem under control, but what it's really doing is actually the greatest form of control. It's telling people only enough so that they feel like they don't have anything to fear. And the goal here is that we want to give people open and honest information so they can inform themselves and make their own decisions. And by involving all levels of stakeholders, an organization can build messaging that takes into account all of these divergent worldviews that we discussed earlier in the webinar. And these viewpoints are, the divergent viewpoints are becoming much more prominent to us during the pandemic. So how can we do this? We have to create opportunities for individuals and our stakeholders to understand what and why, not just how. So this means not just telling them what protocol is in place, that you have to wear a mask when you arrive or that you have to buy tickets in advance, but it's explaining the risks involved and why the protocol is in place. I think there's this assumption that everybody knows what the coronavirus can do, how we can mitigate it, but there are such complex information systems now where people are pulling their information that we can no longer assume that everybody feels the same way about how they can mitigate the virus as we do. So we need to lead stakeholders to our information sources that the organization is using in creating its mitigation plan. So for staff, Ideas would be that we could have presentations from local government officials or epidemiologists. You can share articles about recent incidents from other organizations that have similar activities, or you can even use simulation videos and send that to people so they can watch it from home. And for patrons, this can include in-depth information easily available on website or social media. It could be radio interviews, if radio or TV interviews, if you find that that is a local source of information that's important to your area. To talk about why you are putting forth a safety plan and what the risks are that are involved. And at the heart of this, and we know social scientists in the disaster field always come back to the foundation of all crisis communications, and in this sense, safety communications is all about trust. There has to be trust in order for the communications to be effective. And that trust means that the communicators are legitimate, credible, and disinterested, which means there isn't, of course, that political bias. And that the communication process is fair and in the best interest of the public. So lastly, we'll think about how we can start to build this trust through safety communications. And the most efficient place to start, I think, is by creating guiding principles for your organization, institution, business, in safety communications. And I like to call it the COVID commitment statement. And this statement is something that can be used internally and externally to show staff and stakeholders that your organization is not just committed to safety, but how they are committed to safety throughout the pandemic. So as I go along, I encourage you to write and maybe write some of your own ideas out. You can also put the ideas in the chat box for others to see. And I'll get started here. So first of all, the why. When we're writing this commitment statement, it needs to not just be that the organization or institution is committed to safety. Often when I see emergency plans or safety protocols put on websites, it's lacking heart. It's lacking meaning of why are you committed to safety. So I think that's important to think about and then put into writing, that it's not enough just to say we are committed, but it needs to be more compelling and more meaningful. An example here, move my mugs, that our board of directors, staff, and volunteers acknowledge that health and safety are a significant factor in meeting our goals and accomplishing our mission throughout the pandemic. So that really connects health and safety with the mission and the programming of the organization. And next, it's important to reiterate, even though it can seem obvious, I will say for those in the museum sector, this motto of people first can be a little difficult to reconcile because they're working in preservation with artifacts that have such historical meaning and move past just the lifetime of one person. So I do understand that, but particularly in the pandemic, the idea that people first, that is important in building trust with your stakeholders. Here's an example that I've pulled from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I thought this was great. They put this directly on their homepage. Nothing is more important to us than the health and safety of our community, and we take seriously our responsibility as a civic institution that serves the public good. The next step, there's only 3 more here, so thanks for staying with me. This was probably the most time consuming, and this is listing what areas of safety are addressed for the institution for all stakeholders and then to make it public. And this includes, I think, making public to external stakeholders what you are even doing for internal staff, even your independent contractors and those third parties that you're working with. Sometimes external parties, it makes them trust an organization more if they understand how you're taking care of your own employees. Let's go ahead then, if you could, Kristen, and launch poll question number 6 real quick. This question can help us better understand what areas of safety need to be addressed to make people feel safer. Now, I realize that some of these are already legally required, so an organization has to do them. But I think it's important to still ask the question of individuals if what makes them feel safe returning to work, or if they've already returned to work, to continue feeling safe at work. Because this could help inform a cultural leader if they need to go beyond what is legally required, or it can help you conversely understand if there are frustrations or resentment regarding some of the legal requirements. For instance, mask wearing, and someone might be very frustrated that they have to do that in their workspace. So I'll give you a moment. Again, please check all that apply. It's multiple choice. Thank you. Okay, Kristen. Thank you very much. So a majority, 80%, said that washing your hands and distancing measures between workspaces are the most important in making you feel safe as an employee returning to work. This information, again, is important to know to help enforce it and maybe create extra communication channels to remind people about these particular protocols. But also, if we look at 0% taking temperature and testing for the virus, some organizations might be going maybe too far and spending more money than they need to make people feel safe if it's not legally required. So this information can be very helpful to know. So this is for employees, and poll number 7, if you could launch that one, Kristen, and this will be the last poll of the webinar. This one focuses on visitors and patrons. So what measures do you think will be or have been most successful for patrons to feel safe attending cultural events? And the key word here is feeling safe. I'll give you a minute to do this one. I know it's a little longer than the others. Okay. Thank you. So overwhelmingly, the protocol of having hand sanitizer present seems to be common across the board, with a majority also feeling strongly about security present, as well as requiring advanced ticketing. And that's interesting regarding having security present. I think that could really inform a cultural institution about whether that's an appropriate expense and to go forth to get people to want to attend events. So thank you. Thank you all very much for your time filling out the poll. So again, these polls and these questions help us better understand what areas of safety can be addressed to make people feel safer. And again, even though some of them are legally required, it's important to know that sometimes institutions need to go beyond what is just legally required. And alternatively, sometimes cultural institutions have to address those divergent viewpoints in the community, because some people will find the legal requirements or even non-legal or suggested requirements very frustrating, and it may keep them from attending. And two more areas for this commitment statement. To identify the position responsible for creating and implementing the action plan. If an institution doesn't already have an emergency planning manager or operating facility manager, I have seen some institutions create a special COVID safety manager. And I think it could really be any sort of title, but this person needs to have considerable knowledge of the facility, needs to be safety and detail oriented, realistic and patient, and a good listener, because not unlike what a union representative would be to a cultural institution, this individual ensures the implementation of the safety plan. And they can be also a point of contact if rules are not followed. And they can oversee training and other implementation methods that need to be in place, especially if the virus were to create a further crisis, if staff were to contract the virus and how to deal with it at that point. The key here is naming a person and then letting the stakeholders know about this person. So it's not just saying as an institution, we are looking to our Ministry of Health for guidance, but it's saying we have someone in our institution that is building relationships with the cultural ministry, but also staying apprised of information from experts and researchers in the field, reviewing internal policies regularly, and overseeing training and implementation. This really helps build trust with your stakeholders to have this specific person and what they're going to be doing to help ensure safety in the space. I will say anecdotally, I've heard of certain artists in rehearsals noticing that other people are not following certain safety regulations, and those individuals feel like they cannot say anything for fear of retribution. And I think it's important that everybody know who they can go to say, this is making me feel uncomfortable, I'm not feeling safe. That's an important role here for this emergency planning manager to take on. And lastly, this call to action. And this goes back to the idea that all stakeholders need to be engaged and committed in this process. It should encourage participation for that open conversation, that exchange we've talked about, that's ideal in safety communications and in building trust. Here is a great example. Every employee, volunteer, and visitor has a voice as we plan and implement increased health and safety measures. We want all our stakeholders to inform themselves of our plans and respect the safety measures in place. We are open to feedback and ideas to ensure stakeholders feel safe at our institution. This is where it's a bit different. Often organizations are afraid to put a person as a point of contact to get ideas from the outside. And I understand that in some ways it's opening Pandora's box, or there's so many other mottos that we can attribute that to. But the idea that it would bring in too much information. But often just people seeing that they can share information is what they need to know in order to feel that they can trust the institution, that they have the ability to communicate if they have concerns. And that's also why you can just list an email address and not a phone number if you have concerns about receiving too many comments from the public. Okay, and as we're finishing up here, I do have a few last words, but are there questions specifically about this COVID commitment statement or safety communications?
By now, it doesn't seem like there are, but I would suggest that you make your final statement and we then open up the discussion and invite everybody to join us with a video or tone.
Great, great. Then I will make it very brief so that we have time. I just want to quickly say that I teaching a professional development course that I've been teaching for a number of years now, but we have an 8-week course for working professionals on building an emergency plan, and right now a pandemic safety plan. And the next one starts in January, and it's all online, all asynchronous, to fit people's different routines and schedules. So if it's something that you have interest in, I encourage you to look more on the website about it, and it would be nice to have you in the class. And lastly, I just feel like saying that making people feel safe is not about just having the theoretical knowledge or the resources. It's really about committing to this and having sound leadership. If leadership is not committed to the idea of safety, then that trickles down further down the chain. And that also means that it starts to erode trust with the public as well. So with that, thank you, vielen Dank. And I would like to open it up to any questions in the discussion. And here are my references, by the way, with hot links should people have interest.
All right, thank you so much, Leah. As I thought, it was of course highly interesting and a lot of aspects that we could talk about. But before Julia and I start with some questions we have, I would like to invite all of our participants to talk to us either via chat or tone, or if you like a video, to exchange your ideas, your thoughts, and of course your questions. And I would say we stop showing your screen here to make sure that we have a little bit of space for the videos of our participants. So everybody feel free to join us. And I would like to start with the question, how do you think, how intensive should this kind of communication be to audiences, visitors? How often should arts institutions tell them about all of these safety aspects? Can it be too much at some point as well?
That's a great question. I think that generally the touch points, if you know that your website is an important information channel for the public or for your audience, then that should be where you put the information mainly, so that people know where they can go and they can read it if they want. I do think there is a saturation point, so you have to make sure it's relevant to people. And that's when you can say, okay, we know these ticket holders are coming to our show. Obviously, they beforehand would like to probably know what safety protocols we have. So emailing that to them because they already have tickets. Or, of course, you could, when doing in your marketing, you could always, during the pandemic, have just a small tagline that says, for our safety protocol, visit our website, and then have that on the website, first and foremost, for people to see, or at least on the homepage. That way it's not such a saturation where people are seeing it all the time, but at least people know where to go.
Yeah, and I think, or at least for Germany, I think that the aspect of making staff feel safe is something that might be a bit neglected, that people, leadership persons are not really thinking about. So how, when I'm an employee and I've got a feeling that I'm not really safe in my working conditions currently, what is a way to tell my leaders, my superiors, that I want to feel safe, and also that security communication inside and outside of the institution should be improved?
I think this is where where a leader really should appoint somebody to be the pandemic safety manager, or the COVID guru. I mean, really pinning your office culture. It could be something even fun, the title, but knowing that you have someone to go to, I think, is very important. That's a safe place. Some office culture, people don't feel comfortable bringing about these concerns. And if that is the case, I think that's where you have outside bodies that you can talk to that could then contact the leader of your organization if it gets to that point. And that's why I'm glad we have these outside bodies to help enforce some rules. But ideally, a leader should have a point person that is willing to listen, able to listen, and can communicate between the leader and those that are more on the operational level.
Yeah, I think in a lot of German institutions are public ones, and I think city councils and people like that really have these measures that also the arts institutions have to deal with and have to behold on.
Right, right. But I do think that, I mean, and I'd like your perspective on this, that it is still possible, even as a public institution, to appoint someone within your organization to be a point of contact for communication about issues. Don't you think that's still possible?
Yes, I mean, it surely always depends on the organization and the organization culture, of course, which is, as we currently see, a huge topic in German institutions. Theaters are heavily discussed currently. But yes, hopefully it should be possible in every institution, of course.
Okay.
And so when we think of the different target groups, you talked about a bit earlier in the webinar, like women and women are feeling less safe usually compared to men and aspects like that. How can there be a form of communication that addresses these different needs and target groups without making them confused, without giving out different kinds of statements?
That's a really great question. And I think so much of it is customized to a particular area, to a particular region. Some regions may not struggle with that bias as much as others. I have found that in more rural areas, in my research, that's where those perceptions of risk really are different between minority groups and majority groups. In urban areas, it actually can be less. So I think it depends, on where the organization resides, but also I think that's where survey information is important. If you see that, yes, this person is a woman, and collectively the women seem to be more concerned about touch points being cleaned than men, maybe then for women's restrooms, they have additional signs. Or do you know what I mean? Like there can be maybe more subtle ways of making the women feel more safe that is not so offensive, but maybe just more subtle like that.
Yeah, I mean, also, I think there's no point where someone feels too safe. So maybe it's always the best solution when you think of public communication, social media, and so on, to really give people a very high level of feeling safe, because it can never be enough, I think.
Right. Well, and to that end, asking female patrons or visitors to write a testimony saying, I went to this event and I felt safe. These are the protocols, or it was so enjoyable. And then there's that subconscious connection that other women in the community will feel just by seeing a female face with that quote. So that could be another strategy, using social media. Media too.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And so my final question would be, hopefully at some point, world will go back to normal, or at least more normal than we are now, and the pandemic will end. What do you think? How long should arts institutions keep on communicating all of these safety aspects? like when there's a really low, when we're at a really low rate, maybe somewhere next summer? Or what do you think, when can they stop?
Mm-hmm. Again, I think it should be custom to the region, because really it's hard to know how long people are going to fear contracting the virus. But I would say you can obviously use data. I mean, if the rate of infection is at 0, then you could probably feel safe in saying to people, because the rate of infection is at 0, we are no longer going to be, putting this information out all the time or following these certain protocols. So of course, I feel like it needs, as an American, I think it's important to say this, I think it should be scientifically driven. The decisions to no longer put that protocol out there as much. But I will say that that's where surveys are important, because even with the infection rate of 0, I do think psychologically it's going to take years for people to not have an aversion to strangers, to not have an aversion to large groups. There's going to be that mental bias. Okay, I know statistically it's safe, but emotionally, I'm not able to feel that way. And how else can we know that unless we ask people? And then if we ask, then we can continue to try to maybe follow through on protocols, even if they're not needed anymore.
Yeah, so maybe a certain level of safety communication should be a permanent part of communication.
And that's I think that's a smart and sound way of approaching it. Is why does it have to be a pandemic? And that's a great thought, Kristen. Why does it have to be a pandemic for us to talk about safety? Maybe from now on, that will be a change. We'll find hand sanitizer at every entrance and exit for years to come. It will just be then a new normal, certainly. Yeah.
Okay, so we are exactly at an hour now, and it seems like there are no questions at all.
Okay.
So I would say we're gonna stop here. And as you said, if there are any questions to Leah that come to you in the next hours, days, or weeks, you can either write an email to her, you will find her online, or write an email to us, and we will, of course, connect you. And of course, I have to say thank you to Leah again. It really was a pleasure and highly interesting. And hopefully we can see each other person to person again, as long as you're in Germany. And thank you everyone for joining us. We wish you a great day. And of course, we will let you know about the next edition of our webinar as soon as we have some specific information about that. So thank you very much. Have a nice day and hopefully see you next time again. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.